Hey guys, my name is Anthony. I'm here with my friend Dominic. We're going to be doing a sort of like a live commentary voiceover of a lesson Dominic had a while ago so that we could give some feedback, give some intuition into the actions that we're doing. I don't know, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. So right now what's going on the screen is I'm doing active footwork. And active footwork is just something to keep balance and distance control. So right now in the drill, I'm doing a quick arm extension to the wrist and then finishing on the chest. This is really useful for time reaction. You can be fencing someone and they might do a swift action where their wrist is available, and doing repetition of this action, you'll be able to just simply extend your arm and hit the opponent. I find it very useful as a practice tool. And anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that like active footwork in general, like the reason you don't see people just like standing there in fencing is just because you have to be ready at all times to go, whether it be a lunge, a flesh, a step forward, or any combination of those. Like mobility in fencing is probably your greatest asset. Whether to go forward or backward, like extending your arm can only get you so far. I think in like exercises like these where it's like very simple actions, like earlier it was just like hit the wrist and then extend towards the chest. Now Dominic's doing a bit of lunging, so it's different. But earlier, I think the point of those exercises is to really nail your footwork, where you don't even have to think about it, and you can relax the rest of your body and simply focus on hitting the chest as sort of efficiently as possible, sort of just mentally preparing yourself for the rest of the lesson. I say like one thing, like I think it's better to be a little bit more relaxed in the situation where you're not necessarily paying attention to how your feet are moving, but you're really just letting your shoulders drop and letting your point be as precise as possible. I think minimizing things you have to worry about will get you the most out of any lesson, but that just comes with time. And you'll see like when Dominic moves his feet, like when he's bouncing, as you should do, you should keep the bounces, the time between each bounce, like as small as possible, because that time you're in the air is time you're vulnerable, like vulnerable. Like it's sort of like that. And if you can minimize that, that means you'll be ready to pounce at any given moment. And so like keeping your knees bent, keeping your feet on the floor, but still having that like slight mobility will keep you active and ready to spring. The back foot's also important. Like oftentimes, like when you'll see me fence or when you'll see Dominic fence, like our back toe will be the only thing touching, and that's mostly for like mobility's sake, right? Because if your foot is oriented forward, you're more likely to go forward and all that.
So with the whole back footwork, you're always moving both your feet at the same time. So you're coming in and out of distance to mess with your opponent, and at the same time, you're not going to be standstill. So right now, I'm doing a simple arm extension towards the coach's wrist, and then I'm disengaging and finishing on the chest. Now I'm doing this with a lunge. I would say it's a very, very useful action because you're practicing the disengage and the extension at the same time while doing active footwork. But when I'm disengaging, it's not moving the wrist, and here I'm more using my index finger and my thumb. So here I had a little mix-up getting caught in the blade. And Anthony, could you explain about the disengage?
Oh yeah. So you never really want to keep. You never want to in fencing. You never really, especially in épée, you don't really want to think about the blades touching. You really want to think about the target and how you can do the simplest action to yield a touch. That's all you want. You want to hit them a single light. And right now, essentially what you're doing is you're managing your arm, you're like the extension and compression of your arm with your footwork at the same time. So this is why it's important to keep your legs nimble, and most importantly, keep them loose. You oftentimes see people when they get nervous in fencing that their back foot will get stiff, and that's not a good thing because then you lose mobility because you're focused too much on your arm, and you don't have the proper mastery over your leg, so that your back foot will act as a hinge instead of as like a spring. So yeah, in this instance, coach is trying to throw as many things at you as possible to keep your arm and your legs in tandem. You want to like manage your body, really having mastery over like how you're moving. So I think that's the point of that exercise.
So I think one thing to point out from the last clip would be my foot was more of a standstill. So when you're doing lessons and actions like this, you should probably be more in sync with your moving your back foot and your front foot at the same time and parallel. Like as of right now, I'm doing a little bit more, but you can see I was getting a little bit lazy, keeping my back foot planted and only moving my front foot, but you should be moving both at the same time just to get in that distance, create a tempo, and really prepare for your actions. And it'll give you more of an explosiveness. And if you rely on the back foot, you're putting all your weight on the front foot sometimes, and you really want like a sync, like a harmony. So right now I'm doing a preparation 6 and then disengaging, finishing on the chest. And
yeah, it's a bit like a second intention action. So like oftentimes you don't want to, depending on your opponent, you might want to play the game differently a little bit. But like what Dominic's doing here, as the lesson calls for it, it's essentially like a preparation on the bell guard, or just like a feint in general, followed by a second intention action. So second intention actions are predicated on you not initially going for the touch, but setting up the touch with some sort of feint, some sort of preparation, and then either disengaging or parrying or doing whatever other action to actually score the touch. So in this instance, it's looking like a preparation 6 maybe, and then disengage 8 into the lunge. You could also do other things where you'd feint to the mask and go to the foot. That's another example of a second intention action. First intention actions being the opposite, where you just sort of flesh to the body or lunge to the wrist or something else. It's also important to keep your fingers and let them do the work instead of your hand, because there you minimize the distance your point has to travel around their guard. So that you're really just using your fingers to disengage instead of your whole body or of your whole arm.
And I think what really highlights that is you'll see throughout the video, sometimes my blade might get caught, and that's all due to the point of me not using my 2 fingers, or I might be a little late with it. I feel like a thing for a beginner fencer or even a mediocre fencer is to really master, those front 2 fingers and getting that steady disengage. It's something that will take you a lot farther. And me as a French grip, that's why I was choking up on my French grip, just to get that easier disengage. So now what I'm doing is a little hit underneath the wrist, preparing with a little hit underneath the wrist, and then throwing my leg back to get out of distance. So I'm getting how would you explain it, Anthony? I'm creating something hostile with his wrist and then throwing my leg back to get out of there. So I'm not really getting hit or putting myself in too much danger.
Yeah. So like you see here, like distance is everything in fencing. Like as I mentioned earlier, it's your really greatest asset. And I'd say like learning how to manage your arm extension with your legs is everything. And that's just getting comfortable with your own body and your own weapon. Like it depends if you're a pistol or French grip sometimes. But here, I think one thing Dominic maybe could have done better, like he mentioned, is maximizing the chance for you to hit someone, but also minimizing the risk you might take. And sometimes there's a fine line between that, because when you have a really long distance, there's no chance you're actually going to hit them because you're too far away to hit them. But at the same time, they can't hit you. Okay, so nobody wins. But at the same time, if you get too close to them, anything could happen. You could score a single. They could score a single. At the worst case scenario, a double. So that's why distance really plays a large role into risk. But if you get good enough to manage your footwork and manage your blade work, then you're not taking any risks. You're simply playing at an advantage when you are able to manipulate the distance in your favor, and sort of eliminate the uncertainty behind what your opponent's going to do, because you are manipulating them with your footwork.
So I think one thing to point out right here is you can see Mark's getting a little frustrated with me, and I look a little frustrated, because if you see when I'm doing these preparations towards his wrist, instead of keeping my tip more towards the ground and rotating my wrist and point up towards it, I'm more of doing a straight line towards his wrist. I should be more of a downwards position, hitting his wrist, getting back to my regular fencing position so I don't get hit. So the whole point of this preparation / touch is to do a sneaky touch towards the wrist, but minimize the probability of yourself getting hit. So right now is, instead of going backwards, I'm going forwards. So I'm doing the underneath the wrist, and then the coach will come forwards, I'll take a parry 4 and then finish. So it's more of like a reaction time. So when you're actually fencing, it'll be much faster. So naturally, if you go underneath the wrist and try to go forwards, you just swiftly take a parry 4 and then riposte. And I would say that's very, very useful as a parry 4, something the person's fleshing you, lunging at you, and you really don't have much time to take 8 or another parry. You can swiftly take a efficient 4 and hit the person.
Yeah, I'd say like 4 is kind of like an unusual parry. I tend to like it a lot. I do it maybe like too instinctively sometimes. But one thing to note, like when I saw Dominic doing the 4, oftentimes when you're doing any parry, you don't want to rotate your body too much. 4 is sort of like a special case where you also don't want to rotate your body. Like if I'm going to take that offensively, sometimes like I'll take a parry 4 and then or like a opposition 4 straight like lunge like the shoulder or something. Or oftentimes like I'll straight up just I'll take a preparation 4, continue with the preparation. So that their blade just slips off of mine and inflict to the side of their wrist, right? But I never let my body rotate with my parry. Only time that might happen is if I'm taking like a defensive 4 and I'm turning when they're fleshing into me, just so I can like minimize my body's like my available area for them to hit, right? So you always want to sort of like be the master of your own weapon and not let it rotate your body, because then you run into complications because you might miss because this and that. So basically, to keep a good posture ties into that. To keep a steady blade ties into that. And to keep strong legs ties into that. I think those three make for a very good position for fencing.
So what's going on right here now is I'm doing a preparation towards his face, just to get the person to react. And then once they stick their arm out, I'm taking a parry 8 and finishing on the chest. And then you can see it's kind of sloppy. I mean, right now I'm getting used to the actions. I'm not fully aware of it, but I think that's with anything. You know, the speed is completely slower. This would be much more fluid of an action if it was just purely faster. So now what I'm doing is instead of doing a preparation towards the face, is I'm going right to the foot to either I'm gonna hit the foot or the person's just gonna come forward. So this is like a double whammy. I'm either gonna hit the foot or create a new action where I can do more stuff. So instead of just going to the chest now, just to be less hostile and minimize myself getting hit, I'm going right to the wrist. And I'm doing 3 hits on the wrist, 1 underneath the top and the side, and then finishing with a lunge. And I would feel like this is more for quickness. You know, it's not really something you're not going to use all the time during a bout, like 3 hits on the wrist, but it's just going to happen naturally. So one thing I felt after doing the wrist touches is someone might just get close to me in a fencing match, and naturally I'll do a arm extension on the wrist and hit them. And it will surprise you, you know. The more you fence and do these lessons, you'll realize these type of things. And I feel like right now with the foot touches, I'm just establishing my distance, and without looking at the foot, you never want to forecast where you're going to do your touches. So one thing I would like to highlight is instead of looking at the foot, more just look at the person's shoulders and throw your blade towards the foot, and then go off the rest of the actions.
Yeah, I think another thing that makes this particular action so effective is you're sort of like I mentioned earlier, you're manipulating like sort of fencer's instincts a little bit, and part of what made the feint to the face so impactful is that people just tend to react, right? Because in competition setting, like you behave a little bit differently than you would in training, where you'd think that you have mastery over your technique, but then suddenly your motions get in the way and you just react, right? And so what's very important that you as an opponent do is that you switch up your fencing style kind of frequently in the bout if things aren't working, or just to keep a level up on your opponent, right? Like that includes acceleration, right? Changing your speed to one from slow to a fast action when you're ready to pounce, right? Sometimes it can mean changing the footwork, changing the tempo of how often you bounce, all those things. And part of what makes the foot and the face such attractive targets is that people sort of just instinctively tend to draw their blade to wherever yours is pointing, if it's at their face or at their foot, right? So you can expose that, right? In this instance, Dominic's starting out with a preparation to the foot or an attack to the foot, so that if the blade was drawn downward, he can hit the top side of the guard. In this instance, if the blade's going up, he's going to hit the underside of the guard, right? So here, right now, if you watch, foot, under the guard, over the guard, disengage, lunge, and then disengage from the parry, lunge, or hit the chest, right? So you're sort of just, in this instance, playing for accuracy and playing for footwork, playing for, you know, managing all of these things in a real bout is kind of difficult, so that's what you want to do in training.
I think one thing you can see right now is on the very last touch, I'm getting kind of caught up. So if you really have good footwork, that will really not happen. So I'm really lunging towards him, really far lunge. I'm getting just too close to him. You want to have a faster lunge, arm extension, and get back to your on guard position extremely fast. So right here, I'm getting caught up just because of terrible footwork and lunging too far.
So I'd say like fatigue also plays a part into it, but yeah, like right there, like that was caused because Dominic began the action from too far away, right? And he was sort of like leaning on the blade instead of letting his feet carry his weight and sort of simply just moving a tiny bit more forward. Like even there, like the lunge was sort of like overextended where he was leaning into the lunge more than, you know, keeping a straight composure in case he needed to go backward. You know, and fatigue is part of it, but just generally speaking, that's what I'm seeing here.
And I think that's something that you'll learn during lessons is you'll learn how to deal with this fatigue and how your fencing will change. You have to really adapt to your body because in these longer bouts in the DEs, finals, etc., your body and reaction time is going to go much slower. Like, see, the coach extended his arm and hit me very swiftly and I didn't even know what happened just because my legs are getting heavy. And this is where that active footwork comes into play, you know. That's why during these lessons you always want to be doing active footwork and moving and not just standing there to help yourself and your body prepare for these excruciating moments. You see, I'm huffing and puffing for air, but it'll become natural because when you get tired during bouts, you always fall back to bad habits and whatever you learn naturally. And if you establish strong habits and active footwork as like your natural thing instead of just standing there, everything will be going into play.
Mm-hmm. I think also like watching like other professionals fence like will sort of like point you in the right direction in terms of like what you should be building your footwork around, because I'd say like for a beginner, like if you shouldn't screw up one thing, it's definitely the footwork. Just because you could build off of, you know, anything you need to if you have good mobility, if you have a mastery of where you place your feet and how you place them. I think that's really the foundation for fencing. And if someone taught you wrongly how to like take parries or how to like manage your blade, that can always be fixed. I'd say better or more easily than with how you move your feet. I don't know. I feel like that's just my personal opinion. That's probably a topic of discussion. But here with the flèches, like I think you can just see how important it is that if you were standing up, how much time you would waste simply by bending your knees and then attacking. You'd probably waste half the time, half the window you would have to actually score the touch. So that's why keeping your knees bent and keeping them mobile enough so that you're ready to spring in that instant, right? This is a lesson, it's different. We already know that we're going to lunge, and the coach is preparing us to lunge, or excuse me, not to lunge, to flèche. So he's not taking a parry, he's not going to do anything else but simply let us attack. So this is a very easy example, theoretically. So, you know, being prepared to sort of predict when these moments will arise means you can start your attack earlier, right? And sort of catch them as soon as they drop their guard, right? So if we like take a look at what's going to happen here, again, playing at that initial reaction, the blade goes to the face, we take the feint, the parry instinctively comes, and then Dominic goes straight to the foot, hits under the wrist, in that little window he has left, disengage. So you're sort of like putting it all together again.
Yeah, and I feel like this happens to do with any sports. You know, if something happens in front of you, you're going to flinch, and that's the whole point with the feint, is to get the person to just freak out or do some type of blade movement. And with this one is you're trying to get the person to move back or jump a little bit, and you just fly right to their foot. And if you miss the foot, then that's where the wrist touches where to come into play. So it all moves in one motion. You just get in this habit. If you are to miss the foot touch, you just automatically go right to the wrist in a swift action. And some people might think this is silly, but you'll be in a bout and you go down for a foot touch, and the person will to flesh you or stick their arm out, and instinctively you just go after the person's wrist and you'll get the touch. So it's all building your fundamentals, your natural reactions, and it gets really useful in the bout. And one thing I think I could point out here is I'm in a hunched over position. I should be more straight up, and I'm putting all my weight on my front foot instead of just being, you know, in sync with my footwork. And that's why I'm getting caught up. You know, I'm getting lazy, and I have to get a better disengage. And so Mark is doing parry 8, and I have to disengage and finish to the top of his hand.
I'd say also like part of like this is one lesson among many, right? So pointing out the errors is kind of easy here, but in terms of like how you get to the point where you stop making these errors, I'd say it's simply through repetition and athleticism. Athleticism can be taken care of on your own anyway, but in terms of like repetition, fencing is very much a sport like any other, where as opposed to running or swimming, where you're simply building like a cardiovascular endurance or like a strategy within running or swimming or whatever sort of racing sport it is. Fencing is very much repetition based. It's very much muscle memory. In terms of like foot touches, like messing up the foot touch is very easy if you haven't practiced it thousands of times. I remember I had a lesson where we just sort of had like a ring of like mats, and I had to flesh over them like 200 times in one sitting just to get the muscle memory down, just so, and fatigue is an entirely different story. That's up to you. Again, like with the wrist, like not getting caught up on the blade, like Dominic mentioned, that's simply through muscle in your wrist, not even in your wrist, but in your forearm. Like there's a special muscle for that where you could train it by simply doing take parry 6, parry 8, parry 4, parry 6, parry 8, parry 4 at that speed for 10 minutes straight, right? You'll be burning after the first 20 seconds if you haven't practiced it before, right? And I'd say, again, outside of simply muscle memory, a lot of fencing is also a mental game, just like any other. In boxing, it's you versus an opponent. Same thing with fencing, right? So I'd say fencing, I don't know what you appreciate in it, Dominic, but like I sort of appreciate the fact that it encompasses a lot of skills that you take from many sports into one. And it's sort of like also all on you. I don't know, like what do you think about that?
I agree. It has to do with the fact of an individual sport. If you mess up, you can't blame your team. It's all on yourself. And that's where you really have to go back to your training. And it's all about repetition. These things might seem as like simple actions, but this is more or less my first time experiencing some of these actions. So you can see it's very, very sloppy. But the more and more you do them, as bad as it might seem at first, it gets much easier. One thing that was a big struggle for me was the disengage. And it's something I still struggle with, but at first I just couldn't comprehend on how could I swiftly do these two fingers and go forwards. But without having a strong mind and just really forcing yourself to do these things, it'll help out in the long run. And I think something to take in the mind with these lessons is don't be stubborn, be very open-minded. The coach is essentially the master, and you're all learning and taking this stuff in. So do stuff out of your comfort zone, change your repertoire, and just adapt to any situation.
In terms of like repertoire, like you'll notice here, like this type of action sequence is very layered, right? This is reminiscent of something that you might see like Max Heinzer doing like in his lessons, but like he'll get a lot more creative with it because he's already mastered everything. He has the skills, he has the technique already. So the lesson is just simply like cleaning the rust off, like keeping the steel polished, so to speak. And when you see a beginner lesson, they're not going to do any of this simply because they're still learning the actions themselves and learning how to take a 6 properly, take an 8 properly, take a 4 properly, how to lunge, right? See, this is like we're layering a bunch of things on top of one another, and certain actions are practiced for certain reasons, right? That one before was practiced for precision and for speed, right? So you don't gas yourself out immediately. For this one, like in this specific action, you see Dominic is a lot more a lot more poised, right? Ready to hit the wrist and then the chest, right? So this one takes a large amount of focus, right? You want to be precise, you want to be fast, right? But what differentiates this from the other one was simply a lot of hits in a very short amount of time, and you're sort of just trying to manage the speed of it all. Whereas this one is very much about, you see the way his feet are even moving, like he's ready, he's positioned, he's ready, as if he were about to like flesh on coach's wrist, right? So this is very much about timing. So you practice different exercises for different purposes, essentially.
And the purpose of this footwork is it's like 1 and 2 dancing in and out. So sometimes you might see active footwork is a very useful thing, but you can't do it all the time. Someone might figure out your tempo, and you have to mix it up. So one thing you could do is this little step around, but you can do it much faster. So right now we're working on precision and very fast movement muscles. We were just doing something that was very very demanding. And you can't go 100% all the time. So now we're mixing up, switching up the footwork. It's more of a relaxed but very very useful. So you see it's very very fast extensions, half extension on the wrist, finish on the chest. But you never want to be standstill in these lessons. You always want to be moving, and that's why we're still doing this thing with the feet. It might look silly, but you can also use this in a match.
Oh, also something I'd like to point out, like it's somewhat like involuntary, but you'd see like coach at the beginning of this sequence sort of like shook Dominic's like left arm to sort of like loosen him up a little bit. I think that's what the most important thing is here, because as soon as you start getting tense, whether it's in your arms or your legs, like you might not think that other people can tell, but it's very obvious. Like even like uninstinctively, like you will be poised to attack, and like at the moment you do, your arm, the moment you want to attack, your arm, your non-dominant arm will start to raise itself up, right? Like you're prepping yourself, and you give your opponent like a cue that you are ready to attack, which is not something you want to do, and that's why like it's so important here. Like here, coach is correcting Dominic's position. Essentially, what he's wanting is to get a maximum lunge out of him, but with his lower body, but also for his upper body to be relaxed, right? Like here, if your shoulders are very tense, you're doing it wrong, essentially. Like in fencing, a lot of the work is meant to go right to your legs to do all the work, and for your legs to be tired, but for your upper body to be completely relaxed. That's the most important thing. You want your legs to be poised and ready and bent, but you want your arm to be nimble, right? And to just like maneuver it however you need to. So I think if you are stiff, then that might account for why you might be missing touches, right? Especially for very like accurate touches, like on the wrist. Like even here, like I'd say like Dominic's shoulders are a bit tensed, right? For me, I'll be very relaxed. My blade would be much lower, and I'd go up to meet him, and then just lunge, have a very clean lunge, let my legs do the work, come back. The whole time my upper body's relaxed and ready. I'd say that's like so more of my fencing style.
I think one thing to point out would be when I'm doing my lunge, my back leg, instead of fully extending, it's kind of bent a little bit, and then it should be fully extended, like how Mark was showing. You know, hips pushed down for that explosiveness, and don't lean when you're doing these lunges, because you want to keep an upright chest, very good posture, no leaning for the touches, because it's gonna be harder to get back to a fencing position if you do miss your lunge. So I think that's one thing to point out. So absolutely, Anthony, would you elaborate?
I feel like that's a lot of things like people might just start fencing also like struggle with is like well, that shouldn't even be on their radar, but eventually they'll come to the spot where they're struggling with keeping a good posture, right? Because they're just so used to being like so into the battle, so into the bout, so to speak, that they're hunched over, they're ready, they're really like, you know, just they appear to be too much into it, that they're focused so much on what their opponent is doing, on the opponent's blade maybe, that's also a bad habit, that they can't take their mind off of the bout for a second and think about strategy. Think about what's been going on in the past couple of touches that went wrong, and maybe what they could improve on, or what their opponent has been doing. And right, and it's sort of like a lot of about fencing and about is formulating a strategy while you're fencing, right? So you're trying to keep tabs on multiple things, right? And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it's so important to have the footwork down and have the blade work down, the muscle memory down, so that you don't commit memory or like brain power to thinking about those things, because that'll slow you down, right? That'll cost you like time that you could be using to think about other things. So if someone extends their arm, it should be an instinct for you to take six and flesh or something, or whatever your go-to is, right? You don't want to be thinking about your footwork. You don't want to be thinking about your arm like, oh, my arm is tired. You don't want to be thinking about that. You want to be thinking about strategy and where an opening is, right? Not so much on their blade, but on their body, right? I think here we're just having a...
Yeah, so right here, the coach is emphasizing on an explosive lunge, but more of a, instead of a simple lunge, more of explosive and far distance. So right now, I'm flying forwards, putting my front foot up, and doing a very long distance lunge, then retreating. So this is a very useful thing for beginners and also intermediate, just your fast lunge down and then get back and get some more touches. And this is all to do with repetition and like how you react to certain movements.
I'd say like this might seem like when you're watching this video that everything is very repetitive, and that's sort of the point. I'd say a large portion of this lesson has simply been training speed and handling accuracy under pressure of speed, right? Because sometimes in fencing you have a quota to make in like a split second. You have to try to hit two possible touches, right? Because that's what you're presented with, and you want to take full advantage of that. So I think managing that in that short amount of time, hitting multiple targets, is a goal of this lesson, right? And at the end we have a little flash to finish it off. I think we're doing a slightly different action now, but I was going to talk about how the student, the fencer, can sort of fill that gap in their own time. We mentioned earlier about being athletic in your own time. Like, what exactly does that mean? What sort of regiment do you go through? What's necessary? What do you think about like training in your own time, Dominic?
I think training in your own time, that's what all great athletes do. You can't only do practice You can't only practice at a lesson, or you have to do something in your own time with running, jump roping, biking, and doing lunges at home, stuff that'll build you up. But I feel like right now in the video with this lesson, it's more of developmental. I'm building all these techniques to make myself natural with these things. You could tell, like, just based off my body and posture, a little uncomfortable, but it's starting to feel a little bit more natural. Like right now, I'm starting to loosen up a little bit more than I was in the beginning. Right now, I'm going towards the wrist and disengaging and finishing. These things that should be happening very swiftly and without you even knowing it. And this is just all developmental and building it up.
All right. As I'll just add my viewpoint on that. So, like in my spare time, like at this point in my career, I think, given my body's development, I think most of my time has simply gone towards building a cardio that helped me sustain lessons like these for an hour or 2 hours. I think having like a maximum threshold you can hit during tournaments, because tournaments go for the whole day, and that's why it's important to have a very high endurance. Building habits like staying hydrated and all that is cool. So like having a very high endurance, that'll help you to extend those bursts of energy into however long you might need in order to gain that edge over your opponents. Weightlifting is another separate segment that we might get into later, but I don't think it's as important for beginners. For beginners, I'd very much say that fencing takes up like 80% of the regiment, and then maybe like a fifth of it is like actual like just building cardio, and that fencing will help you get there anyway. I think more like training on your own time should consist of practicing accuracy, like hitting a target in your free time as a beginner and intermediate fencer, and then once you get more advanced, simply working on your body. But that's for another time, I think. It's Anthony and Dominic again, back with another segment of commentary. This time we're sort of going to, I think we've covered pretty extensively what's going on in the video, apart from everything outside of fencing. In the video commentary earlier, we explained a lot of the mechanics, a lot of the macro managements that you're doing in fencing. And I think the strategic point of it and the mechanic point of it is very important to know. And I think that's something you should really focus on as a beginner. And I think now we're going to cover some thoughts that might arise in your head, some uncertainties as a student, as a young person, as an athlete, as student athlete training fencing, that as you progress in the sport and you sort of have a greater mastery over the technique, and you're sort of prospecting out your career as an athlete, what the coach's role is, what your mentality should be. I think we're going to speak about that a little bit. Maybe like a site like training regimen as well. I know we touched upon that at the conclusion of our previous segment as well. I don't know. What do you think? Would you want to pick up where we left off, or?
I think just talk about it. So I think one thing to highlight as a beginner fencer is you're not going to see progression immediately. You're investing yourself into these lessons and time, and you're going to learn with experience and bouting. So I would say just don't get discouraged. I mean, there's times I've been very discouraged after a hard loss, just losing 15 to single digits. But you have to go into every match and lesson and take every little thing with a grain of salt and take away always something positive. You have to find out in this lesson what did I not do best and what do I need to work on. But also don't forget about the things you did well and try to enhance on these things. Because I can remember very well in the beginning of these lessons when I first started, I would never think I would get to this point of being able to do multiple actions, let alone I was having trouble just doing a simple lunge. And you'll see your own progression of how you started off as, not being able to do this and just do this and that, like disengage, parries, and even let alone active footwork. But as weeks go on, you'll be able to see, how things digest and take them into mind. And I think Anthony and I have really seen that over the years and seen each other grow. And you can look back on these videos and see how awkward you might feel. But I think you really need to become strong mentally and emotionally, because one thing about fencing, it will test you in all aspects.
Yeah, that's definitely very telling of someone's character is how they choose to respond to different external, stresses as an athlete. Especially at this point in your life. If you're someone who's going into high school right now, middle school, if you're a collegiate fencer or like beyond that, it's slightly different. But in our experiences, I started fencing when I was 8 years old, probably not competitively until I was 12. So about like safe to say sometime at the beginning of middle school maybe. And ever since then, it's progressed to where school started taking a larger role in my life as well. Same for Dominic. I know we started at slightly different points in our lives, but that's besides the point. Like learning to manage all of the stressed life sort of throws at you as a young person, as a student athlete as well, is something to manage. Like I know personally, you contemplate sometimes that is it even worth it? Is this going to be like come to fruition at some point? And I think the answer, I'm not going to be the person to say that, yes, it would always work out, because that's simply not the case. I'd say, though, that having an excellent coach definitely sets a great foundation that you can like jump off of. Like, this is not a sponsored message when I say I had a great coach, right? And I think that regardless of the fact of who you train with, if you have someone who's experienced enough to provide you with every single skill you might need and every piece of life experience, of coaching experience, of as an athlete when they were in their prime, having that insight can take you so far. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Having people good to fence with, that can come at any point in your career, right? But finding a good coach is so very important, and they have their own role to play as the coach. They should push you. More importantly, you should be welcome to take the challenge, right? As an athlete, no matter in fencing, running, whatever sport you do, I think that's very telling of a good character. Like learning how to handle stress during like a tournament. Like, what would you say is like the point where you realized how difficult this was? When was that?
I would say I realized how difficult this sport was once I started going off against fencers who really knew what they were doing. And as a beginning fencer, you can really distinguish like people who quote unquote know what they're doing and people just like you, just based off like footwork and how naturally they move. And you gotta deal with that. You're gonna fence people who are better than you, but you have to outsmart them. And one thing I like to cover right now is me and Anthony, we're not top level fencers, but we are better than average. And I would say one thing that really blasted off my fencing was stubbornly I really did hate the lessons, but they are so important. And one thing that really blasted off my fencing within a year or two is having constant lessons, going over these actions repeatedly, and then going to tournaments constantly and just using everything, going on to the best person I see there and just fencing them. And two things that are very, very important are just lessons and going to competitions. No matter how small or big the competition is just go. No matter what, just go to any competition, even if it's a weekday, no matter if you're the best person there, try to take something away from it. And just constantly revolve around lessons. And then after these competitions, talk back with your coach. What worked, what didn't work, what are some things that you realize you might need to work on, and work on these things during lessons. Create a very good special relationship with your coach, and I think that will really take you far in fencing. Because
yeah, like especially during like the tournaments. Like I know like certain fencers like to record themselves fencing. I never really took that advantage just because I don't know why I didn't, but I think it's a very good tool to have if you can see what mistakes you're making. I know like I have occasional snippets of where my parents did record me when I was fencing when I was like 14 or like 13 or something, or a couple of years ago, and I just cringe. I cringe because I think that's very telling. That's very good that you can tell that you're doing something wrong or you're doing something that not like suboptimally, right? And I think that does come with time. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that sort of like managing stress as a fencer is a skill that should take like your frontmost attention immediately. I'd say like when it comes to regional tournaments, definitely a good piece of advice is go to all of them, right? Because initially you're going to be nervous because you're not sure who you're fencing, you're not sure what the climate is like. But after a while, you sort of gain a sense of who your competition is, and that pool of people is not going to change much if you're fencing at like a regional level, right? Like regardless of where you are, Midwest, Illinois, New York City, Texas, wherever you're fencing, you're mostly going to fence the same people, right? But when it comes down to knacks are a different chapter. Knacks can really breed a huge amount of stress, especially if you're someone who's very new or like emerging in the national scene, right? They can breed a lot of stress for you and have so much, like, you'd think that there's like so much riding on this like one investment, right? Because knacks are expensive. Knacks, you take time to go to them, you go out of your way. There's like pressure, obviously, if you're like a high schooler trying to make results, right? I think that's another thing to touch upon, where I really don't think you should think about results. I'd say you should think about how, if you really enjoy the sport, like how you can improve at fencing, how can you improve in your own time. That's another huge segment to cover, maybe at a later date. But I'd say like managing stress so that you can disregard the externalities and simply focus on your skill, right? See Mark getting mad at Dominic there. It does happen. Coaches have feelings too. But yeah, I don't know. What can you say after that?
So I would say one thing for me managing stress is you need to just open your mind. You know, if you're in a bout where it's getting very, very stressful and close, you know, they're catching up on you, take a moment to just breathe, you know. I had hit a plateau in my fencing, career, you could say, where I was just stressing over each bout and each event so much where I was losing the passion for the sport. And after talking with some of my peers, they told me to just go into the next competition and just purely fence because you love it. And I feel like that's where I gained back that, where I no longer stressed about each match. And I was fencing just because I loved it, taking each point and using my skills and then breaking down, because I was reaching a point where I would really stress once I got to the 10th touch, and then my brain would completely go out of the window for these last 5 touches up to the 15. But treat each 5 just like a pool bout, Just stop stressing over each touch and just really open your mind. And it happens to all levels of fencers. I've talked to some of the best fencers in the United States that have gone to NCAAs, and they say even against people who are just much worse than you, they'll still stress. And no matter the rank or level of each person, is just kind of clear your mind and don't look at ranks. Don't look at how good you think this person is, even if they're an Olympic champion. Just focus on yourself and really build a bond with yourself and your body, and it all comes with time.
Yeah, like competing a lot, it'll slowly drain out of your system. I'd say like I'm at the point where, not simply because I recognize who my competition is, but simply because that I have so much experience, or not so much, but enough experience, to the point where stress from going to a knack doesn't really get to me as much. Definitely not as much as it used to. Maybe not even at all in some certain instances where you just feel good. You're feeling yourself. You know you're going to do well, and so you do well. I'd say that only comes with, again, repetition and time are 2 words you hear us throw around a lot, but that's true. Like just doing things over again and competing as much as possible and training. This all plays a factor, right? The more time you're willing to invest as a student athlete into fencing, the more you will yield quicker, right? That's just how it goes with anything. And I'd say, touching upon the student athlete part, high school competitions. In Illinois, they're a peculiar thing. I know a lot of high schools, depending on where you live, might not have it. I know people who are trying to get clubs going, who are going to be emerging high schoolers, and that's great. See if you're a high schooler, or if you're a middle schooler going to high school, see if your high school does have a fencing program, because those can be very, very helpful. Even if it's just sort of like put it on a resume, you're a team captain or something, right? Whatever you might need from it. But then again, you also get to compete as a team. And I think that's also another aspect of fencing that we haven't really covered as much, the team competitions. Mostly because I think a lot of younger people don't really look upon it more favorably until you get to college or afterwards. That they don't really matter as much. They're mostly for fun. But yeah, high school fencing, I don't know. I didn't really have one at my high school, and I competed only as like an independent person at certain competitions that allowed me to compete. So I didn't really have a huge presence. I don't know, what can you say about that, Dominic?
So touching high school competitions and the team aspect in fencing is the high school competitions, it really helped me build relationships with my fencers, getting close with them. But one thing I would say that brought passion and love for the sport was team events. I had some of my best moments in fencing just purely with my teammates and clubmates in these team events. I can just name hundreds off the top of my head. And it really takes away that stress of the individual aspect of fencing. Everyone thinks fencing, individual. But I could beg to differ. I mean, I have some of the best memories at these team competitions, at nationals, and all of these competitions, just building bonds with my teammates, where it'll be tied in overtime, and you're not the fencer fencing in overtime, but one of your best friends is up there fencing. You have to cheer them on. And I feel like these are memories you'll never forget, and you'll definitely create them through team events, and it's just something I really look forward to.
Yeah. So just sort of like as like final closing thoughts about the safety of the sport. I think it's something also important to mention. As far as I am concerned, fencing is a very safe sport, despite what many people might think, because we're playing with swords, I guess. Definitely safer than a lot of contact sports. About the equipment, everything is very, very well controlled. I don't think there's any reason to worry if you're a parent who's maybe thinking, oh, is my child going to be at risk? If they keep their mask on their head, and so long as they don't screw around with the blades, and so long as they have shin guards, or not shin guards, excuse me, socks, all the proper equipment, which is easily accessible in my opinion. It's nothing too complicated. They should be fine. I have never gotten injured due to a blade. It's like, bruises here and there, of course. I feel like that goes without saying, but nothing that should be raising concerns. The only injuries I've ever sustained were from like stress, from like muscle injuries, stuff like that. And they're very far in between if you take care of yourself, which plays into, if you're older, keeping a good workout regimen, keeping yourself well fed, well rested, and most importantly, especially if you're a student athlete, managing time with school and other extracurricular activities, knowing when to rest especially is very important. If you feel like your body's bothering you and your coach isn't bothering to listen, just don't go to practice. Like, give yourself the rest that you need, take care of yourself, because it's not worth it. Trust me. I don't know, can you speak on like having injury experience?
Yeah, for definitely in fencing, I would say I've never sustained a major injury or any injury at all. You might think with these swords or blades that it's gonna really hurt you, but to be honest, I don't feel it anymore. When someone gets a touch on me, I don't even notice sometimes. You're doing this thousands of times. I don't even feel it. It's just naturally a sport. It's very, very safe. I've never withstood any injuries, and I totally recommend it to everyone. The equipment is very good. It protects you from all the touches, and after a while, your skin kind of becomes adapted more.
It really does.
It really does. Yeah, it becomes adapted to it. When I first started fencing, I would have little bruises on my arms, or like on some places in my arm. And now after a year or two, I realized, wow, I don't really get these bruises anymore.
Because you don't get hit anymore. Too good.
I really don't get hit anymore, or like I don't get hit in these certain spots. And I think fencing is an extremely safe sport. You build relationships off of it, and make lifelong friends. And I've met so many people through this sport that I would never even think, and experiences I've had through this sport that is, if I were doing some other sports, I would never make.
Exactly. Yeah, and even like depending on exactly where you are in life, that might mean different things. I'd say like what pertains mostly to us right now is that we're about to start our collegiate athletic careers, and I think that's just a whole new world. In high school, you got to learn, if you were lucky enough to have a high school team, then there you go. You have already like dozens of connections, dozens of friendships made. Depending on if you go to college with them or not, like you still have those memories under your belt. You make connections in college, after college, like just with any social interaction, really. I can't stress enough how important it is to build a social network of just people you enjoy being around, or people that can provide business assets to you simply because you know them, right? And that shouldn't be the main reason you do it, of course, but it's always a nice plus to have, like, especially in college. Like, I can't stress enough how extensive of a social network that you could build, a friendship network, whatever the case may be. But yeah, definitely a worthwhile experience. Do you have anything else to add before we close?
Surely. One thing to add about fencing is, people might not think it, but it's very diverse. So, you'll meet people from all walks of life, from all around the globe, and you'll never have that in any other sport. I did baseball and basketball for all these years when I was younger, but I never met a person from, let's say, Poland or China or Russia. And whereas in fencing, it's actually pretty common. You'll meet these
very
people.
International, yeah.
Very international. You can even, once you get good enough, travel to other countries for these competitions, and you can mingle with people from all over the world. And I would say it's the only sport like its kind where you can just interact with people. and from all walks of life.
It does have certain boundaries, maybe if you break épées a lot, but that's another story. But for now, I think hopefully we've covered most things that are worth mentioning, worth covering. There will be another iteration in the future. We might get our teammate Joe Guinan to give some commentary as well, but until that